Hello, and welcome to our Microsoft Project Tips and Tricks webinar series. Today is our third day, and it will be focused on resources. Before we get started, let me just remind you of a few logistics. All lines are going to be muted, but to be sure that you get the most out of the presentation today, we will be taking questions throughout the presentation. Please feel free to leverage the chat module within your GoToWebinar panel to ask your questions, and we will be monitoring them. You can also feel free to email us directly. Also, if you get distracted or pulled away during the webinar, don't worry. We will be recording today's presentation and sending the on-demand version to all of the registrants following the webinar. With that, I'm going to let Bridget take over and introduce herself.
Thanks, Amy. I'd like to welcome everyone back that's joined us for one of our previous sessions this week. And if this is your first chance to join us, I'm glad you're here now. I previously gave a brief overview of my background to set the context for the things that we've been talking about and how we cover it. I'm not going to go through all of that again, but I do want to just emphasize once more that because of my background, I always approach using Microsoft Project from a very process-focused perspective. All of my training courses use best practices to try to simplify using Microsoft Project as much as possible while still following good scheduling practices. Microsoft Project provides a lot of functionality and typically gives you lots of ways to perform any single action. I'm not going to try to show you every way to work with the options we talk about today. I will show you, though, what I've found to be the most effective and efficient ways to do things based on more than 20 years of experience with Microsoft Project. During the years that I managed a Microsoft Project help desk, I discovered that people can find many ways to make errors and get results that they aren't expecting in their schedules if they haven't been trained and given some best practices to follow. I want to make sure you understand the why and not just the how. As mentioned previously, we set up this webinar series to cover some key basics from a process and best practices perspective. Some of what I covered today you may already know, but I hope to give you some additional insight into the reasons for how we work with Project. On Tuesday, we talked about starting at the beginning, what things should be done before starting to enter tasks. Some of the things we covered included creating a schedule management plan, setting project options, creating and saving a project calendar, and some information about work breakdown structures and how to use them to build a hierarchy in your schedule. Yesterday, we looked at determining how long your project will really take. We looked at linking, including talking about why you shouldn't use lags with finish to start links, task flows, and estimating. Today, we will talk about how to get the work done on the project by discussing how to create, assign, and analyze resources in Microsoft Project. The format for this webinar is that I will go through some topics, and then I will demonstrate them in Microsoft Project. And as Amy mentioned, we're going to have some spots where we stop for Q&A, so please, if you have any questions, go ahead and type them in. I'm going to be working in Microsoft Project standalone for our sessions. However, almost everything I talk about applies just as much to Microsoft Project using Project Online and Project Server. So I will mention differences as we go along. Today we're going to focus on working with resources. So we're going to start off by covering the resource planning process, and then we will talk about how to implement that process in Microsoft Project. We'll look at defining resource availabilities, assigning resources to tasks, analyzing our requirements versus our availabilities, leveling out any over-allocations that we have, and finally we'll talk about cost resources. Our goal in resource planning is to understand our resource requirements, what we need, as compared to our resource availabilities, what we have. Resource planning helps us to find what kinds of resources we need, how many of each kind of resource we need, and during what time frames we need them. Then we compare that to what we have to see if we have enough of the right resources at the right time. Resource management uses the resulting information from resource planning and enables us to identify which tasks and which projects should get resources when. If there are conflicts across projects, projects must be prioritized. Resources are the things we need to do the work on the project. They include labor, the people we need to perform the tasks. Material, things like wire, metal, concrete. These are things that get consumed by the project. equipment, antennas, special computers, and facilities. Most projects will not need to manage facilities as a resource. This only comes into play when you have specialized requirements. I worked with a company for many years that built communication satellites. Every one of those satellites had to go through testing in some special test chambers. These were facility resources that the company managed in their schedules. In fact, when they first started working with project, resources like these and a few other large equipment items were the only resources they managed in their schedules because they were the main bottlenecks. Labor resources are usually managed in one of two ways: as generics by skill level or resource type, such as design engineer, graphic artist, etc., or as named resources like John Smith and Susan Jones. A resource pool identifies the resources that are available. Resource pools exist at two levels. They're the resources that are available to the entire organization and the resources that the project manager has negotiated for use in his project. The term resource pool is a general term in project management. You won't see that term referenced in Microsoft Project. In Microsoft Project, resource pool information, or our availabilities, are entered into the resource sheet. There are 6 main steps in the resource planning process in Microsoft Project. The first is to define our resource availabilities, or the resource pool, in our resource sheet. Next, we want to define resource requirements for each task in our project. Then we want to aggregate or sum up the resource requirements across time. Look at how many of each kind of resource we need in different time periods. Then we can compare that requirement to the availability. If we have disconnects, if we have gaps, over allocations, places where we have more requirement than we have availability, we may want to look at leveling our project, trying to get rid of those over allocations. And then we also may want to look at trying to get additional resources. If we cannot level out all of our over allocations and we can't get additional resources, then we need to assess what the impact is going to be to our schedule and make that change. If we can't get the resources, the schedule will change. Resource availabilities, as I said, are defined in the resource sheet view. A resource has to be in the resource sheet before it can be assigned to a task. In Microsoft Project, there are 3 different resource types that can be defined in the resource sheet. There's work, which is what we use for people and equipment. Work resources are used by a task and then are available for use by another task when that one is done. Material resources. These are consumable items. They get used up by a task and are never available for use again. And then cost resources. You can create expense cost or budget cost resources. We'll talk about these more toward the end of this session. This is an example of a resource sheet in Microsoft Project. So I just want to touch on a couple of the columns here, the key columns that you'll be working with. So the resource name just holds a unique name for your resource. Try to make it something that people can understand, and it needs to be unique. The type column will hold either work, material, or cost. So those are the 3 choices. If I've defined material resources, I also have the option here under the material column to identify a label for that material resource. So for example, I have carbon fiber defined as a material resource. So what this means is if I assign a requirement of 2 for that carbon fiber, what that's representing is 2 pounds. I want to jump over here to the max units column. The max units column is where we specify the maximum availability that we have for that resource in our project. If we have a resource full-time, we might put 100% in there. If we have a resource part-time, we can put 50%, 25%, whatever the appropriate percentages that we have for that resource. If we have more than one of a particular type of resource, we would specify that by giving a quantity of something greater than 100%. So for example, for both our cyclists and our design engineers, excuse me, we're showing 200%. So what that's indicating is that we have 2 of those resources available to our project. We're going to be talking later about the cost information, so I'm going to skip over that right now. And I just want to mention, whenever you create a work resource, Microsoft Project will automatically create a calendar for that resource. In Project Online and Project Server, there's something called an enterprise resource pool that gets created, and that's created from a central location. And what you'll do is you'll actually select the resources from that pool to put into your project. So you're going to be building your resource sheet just like we have here, but you're going to be building it from predefined resources. The next step is defining the resource requirements for each task. So we've built our resource sheet. Now we want to assign resources to our task. Each task must be reviewed individually to determine the resources that are needed to perform the work. In some cases, you may not need a resource to work full-time on a task, and you can assign a partial resource. So you may assign a resource at 25% for 4 days, or you may specify that this particular task needs 10 hours of time from this resource. As I mentioned, each resource that's created in your resource sheet has a calendar automatically defined for it. You're able to modify resource calendars to reflect vacations and other time off if desired. This increases the maintenance significantly, so only do it if you need that level of granularity in your data. In Project Online and Project Server, the resources and resource calendars are managed centrally. Your organization will make a decision about how they want to reflect time off. As a best practice, resources should not be assigned to summary tasks or to milestones. As we discussed yesterday, tasks are calculated using the values in 2 task fields: type, which is actually sometimes called the task type, and effort driven. Type can have one of 3 values: fixed duration, fixed work, or fixed units. Whatever you fix, Microsoft Project will hold constant and will not change it. Effort-driven is a flag field that can be set to either yes or no. As we discussed yesterday, I recommend that you create a test project to try out all of the different nuances of the combinations of type and effort-driven to figure out what the right choices are for your environment, for your type of work. There are many different ways to assign resources. We're just going to look at 3 of them. So the first one is using the Assign Resources dialog box. This can be accessed under the Resource ribbon by selecting the Assign Resources button. What this dialog box shows you is a list of all of the resources that have been defined in your resource sheet. Using this option, I can select one or more tasks in my project, and then I can select a resource to be assigned to that task or those tasks. I can actually select multiple tasks and multiple resources to all be assigned at the same time, assuming those tasks need the same resources on them. By default, if I use this approach, Project will assign the resource at 100%, that we can see here under units. If you want that resource assigned at something less than that, you can actually type in a units value, and then when you click Assign, Project will use the units value that you typed in. The next method is the task entry view. So in this one, we looked at the task entry view yesterday to talk about ways that we could enter our predecessors and successors. Here, we're going to split the screen again, but this time on the bottom pane, I recommend that you put one of 2 different choices. There are really 2 ways that we can work with resources in the task entry view. We have one option for the format of resources and predecessors. There's also a format called work, and I'll show you those when we get into the demo. And then finally, you can actually assign resources directly into the resource names column. If I click on the cell for resource names next to a task, I'll get this list of resources, all the resources that exist in my resource sheet. And then I can go through and I can check off the resources that I want to assign to this task. Then when I hit my Enter key, Project will automatically assign all of those resources to the task that I had selected. When you use this approach, Project will always assign the resource at 100%, and if it's a material type resource, it will assign it at a quantity of 1. Okay, so let's go and take a look at some of these. First, I want to go over and look at the resource sheet. So the resource sheet is just another view in Microsoft Project. So I'm going to go over here where my view name is, and I'm going to right mouse click and just select resource sheet from the list. I have actually already entered a number of resources into this resource sheet. If I decided that I needed additional resources, I can just add them to the bottom. When I add a resource, by default, it's going to be set as a work resource. But this is where I can specify whether it should be a material resource, a cost resource, or a work resource. Also, by default, project is going to set up the max units at 100%. So if I need to make a change to that, I can do it here. So for example, if I were given 4 technicians to work on my project, maybe I want to set this up here as 400% so that we know that we have that much availability on our project. Once our resource sheet is complete, we can then start assigning resources to our tasks. So I'm going to go back over into the Gantt chart, and I'm going to start assigning resources. So one of the ways that I can assign resources is using the Assign Resources dialog box that I mentioned. So I access that under the Resource ribbon, select Assign Resources. So right here I have just a single task selected. I can come over into my list of resources, select a single resource, and click Assign. So what we'll see is that Microsoft Project goes ahead and assigns that resource to that task. If we see a resource name with nothing else, what that means is that it's assigned at 100%. If I have more than one task that needs the same resources, I can click and drag, or I can click and hold my control key and select additional resources, and then come over into my Assign Resources dialog box and select one, or hold my control key down and select multiple resources that are needed for those tasks. So what Project has done now is it has assigned all of those resources to all of those tasks. If I need to get rid of resources on a specific task, I can select the task, I can click one or more of the resources that I want to remove, and I just click Remove, and those resources will be taken back off again. The next approach that I want to show you is using the task entry view. So I'm going to close down my Assign Resources dialog box, and I'm going to go in and split my screen. I'm going to go in under the View ribbon and just click Details like we did yesterday to work with our predecessors and successors. By default, it is going to show me resources and predecessors. Depending on how you last left your task form view, it may still have the predecessors, successors that you used before. So if so, you can just right mouse click over in this gray area and select the appropriate format that you want this bottom pane to show up in. So what I can do here is I can just select a task that I want to assign a resource to, click under Resource Name. I will get the list of all of the resources in my resource sheet, and I can select a resource. If at this point I just click OK, what Project's going to do is it's going to assign it at the percentage rate that I have specified in my max units. So for example, if I came in here and selected Technician and just clicked OK, what Project's going to do is it's going to take that 400% max units and assign that here as the units value. What we're looking at here is what we talked about yesterday as the assignment units value. So if you remember, we talked about 2 different assignment level fields yesterday. We talked about peak and assignment units. What we're looking at here is assignment units. So if I say, well, I really didn't want 4 technicians working on this, I can then go and select a technician and specify the quantity that I want. So let's say, for example, I only need a half-time technician on this task. I can type in 50, click OK, and it will assign a technician at 50%. I also have the option, instead of specifying the units value, I can specify a number of hours. So I'm going to select Design Engineer, and I'm going to specify that I want that design engineer to also work 40 hours on that task. When I click OK, I want you to notice what happens here. So we talked about what it does is it goes and it looks at the max units value, and that's what it's putting in here. It is not truly assigning that resource across the project at 200%. And yesterday we looked briefly, and I'm going to jump back into it again, at something called the task usage view. And what I want to show you here is we talked about the peak versus the assignment units, and I'm going to actually insert, the peak units here. So this is the task that we were just working with. What you'll see is that even though the assignment units value is showing 200, that's really not meaning anything to us here. That resource, that design engineer that I just assigned, has really been assigned at 50%. And if I go in under my task ribbon and scroll to task, I will see the number of hours that that resource is assigned. So there were some changes in I think it started in 2010 in terms of how these units values worked, and so it's a little confusing here that it will show you this 200%, but just be aware that this units value being displayed here is actually assignment units, so that's the original assignment. It's not the current assignment. And peak units is the one that Microsoft Project will recalculate. The last way I want to show you about entering resources is using the resource names column. So I'm going to go back into the Gantt chart. I'm going to hide the bottom pane by unchecking details. And we're going to work directly over here in the resource names column. So I'm going to click on a task on the resource names cell and click on this down arrow. This is again giving me a list of all of the resources that exist in my project in the resource sheet. So I can just come here and I can select all the resources that I want to be assigned to this task. When I hit my enter key, project's going to assign any work resources that I selected at 100%. It's going to assign any material resources at a quantity of 1. One other thing I just want to point out here, because I find it confusing, and I just want to clarify it for you all. So on the task that we were just working with, this design engineer, notice what's showing here, 200%. Again, that's not really how that resource is assigned. What Microsoft Project displays, both in the resource names column and then also then out here, is the assignment units value. So just be aware of that. That can be very misleading to you and to other people looking at your schedule. Okay. Do we have any questions at this point, Amy?
No, we do not have any questions at this point.
Okay, we will keep going. Once we have assigned our resources to all of our tasks, we can determine when we need each resource based on the schedule for the task. So the resource acquires date information from the task. This slide is just showing you the time-phased resource assignments in the Gantt chart based on assigning resources to our tasks. We also need to understand how many total of each type of resource we need during each time frame for our project. So what we're looking at here is something called the resource usage view. And what we're seeing is the aggregated or summed up requirement by time period. In this example, I'm looking at a daily requirement, and I'll show you how to change that when we get into the demo. But I just want to talk a little bit about what this resource usage view shows us. So what we're seeing are all of the resources that exist in our resource sheet, and then actually under each resource we have the ability to look at the tasks that that resource is assigned to. Now I've collapsed some of these others, but they do have tasks listed underneath them. And then I can look at the time frame that those tasks are being worked and see how many hours the resource is assigned to those tasks. And then at the top level, where the resource name is, I'm going to see the sum or the total number of hours that that resource is needed during whatever time frame I'm looking at. In this case, again, it's daily. So we've got some serious problems with our marketing manager during this particular time frame that we're looking at. And you'll notice that the marketing manager's name is red. In project, red is always bad. Same is true with resources. So what that tells us is that at some point, that marketing manager is over allocated. There's also a view called the task usage view, which we'll look at later as well. And what that view shows us, I always describe it as sort of this one sideways. What that one's really showing us is a list of all the tasks, just like we would see in our Gantt chart, with each of the resources that's required. That's the one we looked at just a moment ago. Once we've assigned resources to our tasks and we know what resources have been provided in our resource pool, then we're able to compare our requirements to our availabilities and determine any gaps that exist. This example is showing something called a resource histogram, which is a good visual method to identify gaps. Now, this one's not straight out of project, obviously, but there is a sort of similar one that is a standard view in project that we'll look at during the demo. I just want to talk about this for a minute. So in this example, we are looking at the resource technicians. And what we're seeing here is we have been given 3 technicians for our project. So that is our availability line, is this green line at 3. Based on how we set up our schedule model and assigned our resources, the requirements that we're showing over time are represented by this blue line. So they're going to vary based on when the tasks are scheduled to happen. What we see here is some what we call resource overloads and some resource underloads. A resource overload is where we have more requirement than we have availability. If we just go ahead and start our project with the schedule like this, as soon as we hit week 2, we are going to have more work to do than we have technicians to do it. So our tasks are going to start slipping. Resource underloads are where we have more availability than we have requirement. So that's a problem also because, for example, in week 4, we have 3 technicians that are assigned to our project, but we only have enough work for one of them. So we have 2 technicians that don't have anything to do and we're wasting money. So we want to really try to look at and resolve both of these. If we have overallocations, or also sometimes called overloads, we can try to eliminate or at least minimize them by using resource leveling. Resource leveling is when tasks are rescheduled based on resource constraints as well as links. So project will look at the resource availabilities versus the requirements and move things around. Leveling will eliminate or minimize the overallocations dependent upon the parameters that you specify, and we will be going over those. Ideally, what will happen is the tasks with the most total slack will be the ones that are moved because those are the ones that can afford to be moved. Microsoft Project has an automated leveling functionality. To use the automated leveling, the first thing you're going to do is select these leveling options and set them up or make sure they're set to what you want. Once you have the leveling options set, then you have a choice of one of 3 ways to actually do your leveling. If I select Level All, Project will level all of the resources and all of the tasks in my project based on the criteria that I've set up in my leveling options. If I select Level Resource, Project will give me the option to select one or more resources to level. So it's not going to level all of the resources, it's only going to level the ones I select. So sometimes people will do this if they have key resources that they know they can't get any more of, and take a look at what the results are there. The third one is level selection, and what this allows me to do is level a subset of my tasks. So I would click and drag through or control click the tasks that I want to level, and then I would select level selection, and Project will just level those tasks. So we'll be taking a look at that when we get into the demo. A best practice caution. Our recommendation is to use automated leveling with caution. Make sure you understand how it works and make sure you carefully analyze your results. Microsoft Project will not always make the same decisions that you would make through analysis of your overallocations as a project manager. So for example, let's say I have a project and during 1 week next month, I have a 1 hour overallocation in my schedule for one of my resources, 1 hour overallocated on Wednesday. Project will try to level out that overallocation because as far as project's concerned, we can't have that. Even if the task is on the critical path, project will push it out. As a project manager, what you would potentially do instead is you would talk to that resource and say, is there any way you could put in an extra hour on Wednesday and try to help us keep on schedule? So just, again, be aware that project is making some decisions based on the information that you've given that you may not make if you looked at it and tried to resolve some things manually. Sometimes what I will do is I will actually try a number of these different options. So I'll set up my leveling options in one way and try to level, then I'll set it up a different way and try to level, or I'll look at, okay, what if I just leveled these tasks or just these resources, and use it as kind of a what-if process to look at some different options and some different scenarios for what you might want to do with your project. There are two main types of leveling, resource limited and time limited. And these are not terms that Microsoft Project uses. You won't see these terms within Project, but these are more general project management terms. In resource limited leveling, tasks will be moved as much as necessary to eliminate over-allocations. So Project will continue to push tasks out as far as it needs to until it can find the resources they need. The only times there will still be over-allocations after leveling with resource limited leveling is if a resource has been assigned to a single task at a percentage that's greater than the max units. So let's say I have a resource that in my resource sheet I've specified I have that resource at 50%. So I have 50% of that resource's time to work on my project. If I then go in and on a specific task assign that resource at 100%, Project has no way to resolve that conflict. So that will remain as an over-allocation. Another time, and this one's less common, or actually they're both fairly uncommon, but with certain types of links, and specifically I've seen it with finish-to-finish links, if the resource is assigned to both the predecessor and the successor, Project may be unable to reconcile the over-allocation. So just know that it is possible that you'll see some over-allocation with resource limited, but it's very unusual. That is what Project does by default. It actually does resource limited leveling by default. We also have an option to do time limited leveling. In time limited leveling, tasks will only be delayed within their total slack. So what that means is that the project end date will not push out beyond the target due date that we've assigned. The way I tell Project that I want to do time limited scheduling is with one of the options under the leveling options, and we'll look at that when we do the demo, but it's called level only within available slack. And what that's really telling Project is you can move tasks around, but you can't move them out beyond where their total slack is, so basically past their late dates. One of the best ways to look at the results of your leveling is to use the Leveling Gantt. So with the Leveling Gantt, we get a column that's inserted into the table called Leveling Delay. And the Leveling Delay represents how much that task was delayed to find the resources available that it needed. The Leveling Delay is specified in ED, which stands for elapsed days. So it's not working days, it's actually a span time. So it's the number of true days. In the Gantt area, with the Leveling Gantt, you'll see multiple bars for each task. So the grayish color bar is the original schedule date for the tasks. The blue bar is the new schedule date for the task. So this is the dates that the task has been pushed out to. And then if you have a skinny gray line, what that represents is the leveling delay for that task. So for example, this manufacturer fork per drawing had 14 days of delay, and that's what we're seeing represented here. We also have situations, for example, down here at task 35, where I have a task that has 0 days of leveling delay, but when I look out here, that task has actually been moved from September out to the beginning of October. So I see the original date, I see the new date, but I'm not seeing any leveling delay. That tells me that this task was delayed because one of its predecessors had to get delayed to get the resources it needed. So whenever you see a 0 but you see a task that moved, what that tells you is that its predecessor forced it to move to get its resources. Once we've leveled our requirements out as much as possible, there may still be gaps, particularly if we're performing time-limited leveling. We need to determine when and how many additional resources we need. We may be able to negotiate for additional resources with the resource owner, or in some cases we may need to use different resources than we had originally planned. The last step of our resource process. If we cannot get additional resources to fill our remaining gaps, we will have to adjust the schedule, and we may be forced to move our project end date out. So this is really critical. One of the things I talked about, I don't remember if it was yesterday or Tuesday, is that you don't want to baseline, you don't want to start work on a schedule that's not achievable. So if you have significant over-allocations in your project, you need to get that resolved. And if that means pushing out your end date, that's what it means. If pushing out your end date is not acceptable, then you need to talk with your sponsor and see if they can work more resources for you. Because if you do not have those resources, the schedule will change. Resource planning gives us some really important information. Do we have enough resources for the tasks that we've defined? When do we need more resources and on what tasks? How many more resources do we need? If we don't get more resources, how is our schedule affected? Where and when do we have too many resources? What can we do to try to resolve the underload? We don't want those resources on our project if we don't need them, if we don't have work for them to do. Communication and negotiation are really the keys to resolving our resource issues. All right, so we're going to go and take a look at some of these things. All right. So the first thing I want to do is I want to show you some of the views that are available to help you analyze your resources. There are a number of different ones that are accessible. We're going to just kind of jump through a few of them for you. So the first one I want to look at is what's called the resource graph. So again, this is just a view in project. I'm going to right-click here on my view name, and I'm going to select resource graph. The resource graph, currently mine is showing in months. I can zoom in and show in more detail or less detail if I want. Over here on the left-hand side, what I'm able to do, currently I'm looking at one of my resources. There's a scroll bar down here in this left section that allows me to scroll through and look at my different resources. So as you can see, as I'm scrolling through here, I see that some of my resources, the resource names are red. Again, what that's telling me is there's some point in the project where they are over-allocated. It may only be an hour, but they're going to show up in red, okay? So if I find a resource that's over-allocated, and I'm looking here at September, and I say, oh no, my marketing manager has too much work to do in September, I can look down here at the bottom, and I can see the peak units value. Now, this is not the same as the peak units at the assignment level that we talked about before. What this is really telling us is the maximum total of assignment across all tasks that this resource has during this time frame. So it's the maximum assignment during this time frame. So what I would want to do at this point is I would want to zoom in to say, okay, how bad really is this? So what I can do is I can start using my zoom in button, my little magnifying glass, and take a look to see just how significant this issue really is. Okay, well good, it's not the whole month of September. Let's keep going and see exactly how much over-allocation we have. So what we end up finding by taking it down to a daily basis is that, yes, we do have some over-allocation in September, but it's only 8 days. So that's going to be much easier for us to look at and resolve than it is if we truly had an over-allocation for the entire month. The next view that I want to take a look at is resource usage. So this is the one that we looked at on the slide. And again, what we're seeing here is all of the resources that exist in our resource sheet and then all of the tasks that they're assigned to. At the very top, I have a group here that says unassigned. And if you notice, these are all my milestones. And as I mentioned, you shouldn't be assigning resources to milestones, so this is exactly what I should see showing up here. So I'm just going to collapse those and get them out of the way. What I'm going to do now, though, is start to look at the resources and their assignments on my tasks. So I have a carbon fiber tech, and it looks like I have some overallocation, and I know that because the name is in red. So what I can do now is I can click on the task name that that resource is assigned to. So that's what I'm looking at here is the list of all the tasks that that resource is assigned to. And then I can go in on my task ribbon and select my scroll to task button over here on the far right. And what that will do is it will scroll my calendar to show me the information where that task starts. So it's going to show me where that task is. And sure enough, we can see that right here during that time frame, we have quite a bit of overallocation. Similar to when we were looking at the resource graph, I can zoom in or zoom out on this information. So if I want to look at it on a weekly basis, or if I want to zoom in all the way and look at it on a daily basis. So again, this is starting to give me some true visibility into what the issues actually are going to be. I also have the option here to insert peak units, and I could also put in assignment units if I want, but I tend to focus more on peak because that's going to show me how much those resources are actually assigned to those tasks. And maybe I can start thinking about, well, what if I only have them working half-time on some of these tasks or something like that? The other thing I wanted to mention is over in the graph area, the spreadsheet type area, currently what I'm looking at is work. I can also have other information show up here. So for example, actually let me expand this a little bit first. Let's say I wanted to look at remaining availability in addition to the work. So what I can do is I can right-click over in this spreadsheet area, and I select, if the field I want to look at is on this list, I can just select that, and actually mine is. Otherwise, I can go into Detail Styles and select whatever field I want to look at here to add to my view. But I'm going to actually just add the remaining availability, which is visible here. So what happens now is every single entry, every single assignment entry now is showing us two values. It's showing us the work and it's showing us the remaining availability. Now we're not going to have remaining availability for material resources. We're only going to have remaining availability for work resources. So what I'll be able to see is where I have additional availability for my resources. Okay. So that's my resource usage view. I also mentioned the task usage view, so I want to jump over quickly and take a look at that. So again, we looked at this briefly in the last section, but again, I just want to emphasize what information I'm seeing here. So I'm seeing the resources that are assigned to it. So this is my assignment level information. If I scroll down here to a task that has multiple resources assigned, I'll see one row for each of the resources. Again, I can insert other columns of information. I can insert peak. And then what we're going to see is for each of the assignments, we will see what percentage that resource is currently assigned to that task. So once again, it just gives us some better visibility into the details of what's going on. Similarly, I can scroll to task and I can actually look at the data over here in my spreadsheet area. I'm going to go back to the Gantt chart now. I want to point out something over in this indicators column. So do you see this little red burning man? This tells us that there are resources on this particular task that are overallocated. So it's not telling us here which one it is, it's just telling us that there's something assigned to that task that's overallocated. What I want to do now is look at leveling. So to do my resource leveling, I go in under the resource ribbon, and as I mentioned, the first thing I want to do is review or set up my leveling options. So I'm going to go ahead and click on leveling options. I'm going to talk about some of these here just so you're aware of what they are. You always, always, always want to keep this particular selection set to manual. You don't want project to re-level your project every time you make a change, so you do not want to set it to automatic. By default, project's going to look for over-allocations on a day-by-day basis. So what that means is it's going to look at every individual day, and if it sees even an hour of over-allocation, it's going to try to move one of those tasks that's causing the over-allocation. You do have the ability to pick different time buckets. So if at the beginning when you're first starting to look at your project, if you want to look at it in a rougher way, you could select week by week. And what that will do is it will only show you an over-allocation if a resource is assigned, for example, more than 40 hours a week if you have that resource 100%. So that's an option. But typically you're going to want to do your leveling day by day. By default, project's going to level the entire span of the project, so from the beginning to the end. That's normally what you're going to want to do, but if you have a very, very long project, or if you're doing rolling wave planning, you may want to just level a certain time period. Maybe you want to level out the next 4 months or the next 6 months or whatever makes sense in your environment. And in that case, you would select this option and specify what time period you want the leveling to be done. And then what will happen is project will just ignore any over allocations that fall outside that time window. The leveling order. So there are two what I would consider possible choices here. ID, don't use it. Standard and priority standard. So standard is basically saying I'm going to look at total slack, I'm going to look at task durations, and those are the main things I'm going to use to make my decision of which task I should push. There is also a task field called priority, which enables you to prioritize that a specific task or group of tasks should be given a resource over another set of tasks. So by default, all tasks are given a priority of 500, but that can be changed. This is the important one that we looked at, that we talked about in the slides. So this is the one where I can specify that I want to do time-limited leveling. If I uncheck that, then I'm by definition doing resource-limited leveling. And what that means is it's going to push out the end date as far as it needs to find the resources it needs. If I check it, then what that means is project will still move tasks, but it will not push out the end date. So it will only move tasks within their total slack values. The rest of these I recommend you just leave unchecked, and I'm not going to actually go into these in detail, but this just allows you to split. If you have multiple resources on a task, it will allow them to work at different times. This says if I have a task that has progress on it, you can split the remaining work off and send that into 3 months from now. Typically, these are ones that you're going to just want to leave turned off. So to start with, we're actually going to do our leveling resource limited. So I'm going to click OK. I'm going to scroll out here because I want you to see that basically we have a project that has a critical path with 6 days of total slack right now. So our project has 6 days of total slack, and what we're going to do now is we're going to level everything. So I'm just going to specify level all. This is that example I was mentioning about where it had a finish-to-finish link. So this one it can't resolve, but we're going to say go ahead and skip that. So what you'll see now is project has moved some things. The blue represents changes in dates. And if we scroll down and look, we're going to see now that we have -8 days of total slack in our project. And the end date of our project has pushed out into November when our target date is in October. So by doing a resource-limited leveling, we are no longer able to meet our completion date. I'm going to clear that out. And then I'm going to go back and do a time-limited level, just by checking that option. And now I'm going to say level all again. So now what you're going to see is it's going to find more over-allocations that it can't resolve because it can only push things as far as their total slack. So I can look at them one by one, or I can just say skip all. Now what I'll see is I now have a critical path with 0 days of total slack, but my project has not pushed out past my target date. So it went all the way out to 10/21, which was the target date, but it didn't go beyond. And what you'll also see is we still have some of those little burning men. We still have some tasks that have overallocation. And that's often what you'll find if you do time-limited leveling. So what I would suggest at this point, if you have an end date that can't move, go look in detail at those overallocations and see if there are other ways that you can address them. So I want to clear that leveling out again, and I just want to show you just quickly the level resource and level selection. So if I pick level resource, it's going to give me a list of all the resources that I have, and I can pick one or more to level and then just say level now, and it's only going to level those resources. The level selection, I have to select a group of tasks, and then it will allow me to specify that I want to level just those tasks. And as you can see, it leveled those out, and the overallocation indicator is now gone. Okay. Any questions, Amy?
Yes, actually, we do have a question.
Okay.
What is the best approach when you schedule a resource that has level of effort tasks by percentage of time mixed with regular tasks?
So I have some tasks that are level of effort and some that are regular resource assignments, I think is what I'm hearing.
By work effort.
By effort, right.
Yeah.
So first of all, there are a lot of different schools of thought of how to handle level of effort work, and you know, there's not necessarily right and wrong. There are probably a few choices for that. But obviously, when you're leveling, level of effort tasks are going to be spanning the entire time. So what I like to do is I tend to just ignore those in my leveling. So I would do a leveling selection, and not including my level of effort. What that will do, though, is it will still most likely give me an overallocation because I haven't included the level of effort. So I can either sort of manually work through that, or I can go in and change my max units to exclude the level of effort work and then do my leveling from there. So it gets a little tricky. Level of effort can get a little tricky, especially when you're trying to do things with resource leveling. But I would suggest one of those two approaches. Either just kind of know that once you've done your leveling, you are going to have to reevaluate, or just pull that quantity out of your max units while you're doing your leveling so that you can take a look and just level the tasks that are true assigned tasks. Okay? Anything else?
Those are all the questions that we have right now.
Okay. So the last thing we're going to talk about is project costs. We're going to start with a few basic definitions. The cost estimate represents the expected cost for performing the project tasks, and it should take into account all kinds of resources and any other costs. The cost budget is the overall funding that has been provided for the project. And what we're going to do is we're going to time phase the budget through our project. By building our schedule model in Microsoft Project, we're able to do bottom-up estimating, which is typically the most accurate way of estimating our project. To do bottom-up estimating, we're going to need information from the schedule to determine how much of each resource we need when. And we also need resource information, including assignments and rates for the resources. We want to make sure we include material and equipment along with labor. Our first step in estimating is to determine our resource requirements for the tasks that we've defined. Then we're going to assign costs to our resources, including any fixed costs. Microsoft Project will then calculate the cost per assignment, so at the assignment level. It then rolls that up to the task level, to the summary task level, and then to the project level. We now have time-phased cost estimates that are based on true project requirements. We can baseline our costs and track against them once we have actual costs that are incurred for the project. In Microsoft Project, we'll calculate our costs bottom-up by assigning rates in the resource sheet to all of our work and material type resources. So we're going to look at putting a standard rate value into our resource sheet for our work and material resources. Using this cost information, this standard rate information, our costs are going to be calculated in the cost field for each resource assignment and then rolled up to the task level, the summary level, and then the overall total project cost. We also can create what are called expense cost resources for costs that are not associated with a specific amount of work. So for example, travel expense. These cost expense resources are created just like work and material resources in our resource sheet. So what we're going to do is we're going to give that resource a name, typically one that has expense in the word so it's easy to spot, and specify that it's a cost type resource. With cost expense resources, every time we assign them to a task, we have to specify the dollar amount for that instance. We also can create budget resources. Budget resources can only be assigned at the project summary level, so to task 0. In this example, we've created 2 budget cost resources. We have a travel budget and a labor budget. So we can create as many budget resources or expense resources as we want. We're going to use the task usage view to specify the budget cost for our project. Okay, so let's go take a quick look at that. I realize we're running close to time. All right, so I'm going to go over here and go back into the resource sheet. And what you'll see is I've actually already entered some standard rates for some of our resources. So the way you do that is you just type in whatever the resource rate is. So for work type resources, you're entering an amount per hour. For material type resources, you're entering a per unit cost. Once you get all of those entered, then you can take a look. I'm going to go back to my Gantt chart. And Project is going to calculate the cost for me. So right now I'm looking at the total project cost. If I change to the task usage view, we'll see that the costs are actually being calculated per assignment, so down at the assignment level. And we can see that here. So this is one of those tasks that has 4 resources assigned. So we're looking at the cost for each of those resources on this task. And then we're seeing the roll up here. So that's giving us the visibility down at the lowest level, at the summary level, and then it rolls all the way up to the top. I'm going to go back to the resource sheet and I'm going to create a travel expense resource. So I just give it a name. I specify cost. I'm also going to do a budget while I'm here. I specify that as cost as well. Now, the way that I tell Project that this resource and this is an expense resource, there's an additional field that I have to insert into my resource sheet called budget. And this is a flag field. And by default, this is always set to no, so you don't even ever have to know about this field unless you're creating budget resources. But for that budget resource, I'm going to change that to yes. Now I'm going to go back over into my task usage view, and I'm going to assign those resources. So let's say, for example, my develop specifications task. I happen to know that that design engineer is going to have to do some travel for that particular work effort. So what I can do is I'm going to use the Assign Resources dialog box. I'm going to come down here. I'm going to find the travel expense resource, and I'm going to go ahead and assign it. Now, as I mentioned, every time you assign an expense resource, you have to put a dollar amount in there. So maybe we say that for this task, it's going to be $1,000. But maybe we also are going to have travel expense on a review task. But in this case, we expect it to only cost $500. So with our expense resources, when we assign them, we have to put a dollar value to them. My budget resource, again, can only be assigned up here at the top level. So what you'll see is I'm still clicked down here on this Incorporate Changes, and it's not going to let me assign that budget. So I can only assign the budget up here to Task 0. So I'm going to select that. I'm going to click Assign. I'm going to come out of here now. And I will see that represented in budget cost. Now, there are two ways that I can enter the actual budget here. I can either type in just an overall amount for the project, or I can actually enter it one by one. Now, what I need to do over here, if I want to see that value, is I right-click in the spreadsheet area, I go into Detail, Styles, I want to look at the budget cost time phase. So I'm going to select budget cost, I'm going to say Show It, and now I'm going to see that that $25,000 got spread evenly across my project. Now that may not be how I want it to, how I want that budget spread. So I also have the option of just going in myself and putting in the budget values. And Project will adjust the budget cost accordingly. So the budgets can only be entered at the project summary task level. Okay, questions?
No questions.
All right. Okay, so that's it. I appreciate you hanging in with me. I'm glad you could attend this week, whether you made it to 3, 2, or 1 sessions. Hope you have something to take away with you. If you have any questions that come to mind after the fact, please feel free to just shoot an email to info@tivity.com. And if it's a specific question, they can get it to me. If it's a more general question about training courses or that type of thing, someone will get back to you. We are in the process of setting up our training and webinar calendar for next year. So if you'd like to be notified with that information, please send us an email to info@tivity.com. Hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.